On the morning of the 12th of November 1972, Harlan County awoke as usual. Thick fog still clung to the hillsides, the trees stood still in the early winter chill, and the small town believed that today would pass as peacefully as hundreds of mornings before. In the police station's duty room, Deputy Chief Martin Kroll was pouring coffee when the phone rang. On the other end was the hoarse, broken voice of a local farmer, as if each word had to be pulled from his trembling chest. He said he had just been inspecting his land when he saw the men lying scattered in the woods. At first, he thought they had been in an accident, but then he saw blood. Too much blood. Kroll paused for a few seconds. He asked again to be sure, trying to keep his voice calm. The farmer simply replied, "I've never seen anything like this in my life. It's like a massacre." As the police car pulled onto the dirt road leading up Blackburn Ridge, Crowell couldn't quite picture what awaited him. But the moment he stepped out of the car and gazed into the eerily silent woods, he understood that some mornings never end, and some calls will haunt a person for the rest of their life. Harlan County in 1972 was not a place where people sought to get rich, nor was it a place where the law prevailed in the way outsiders imagined. It was a mountainous corner nestled against the Kentucky border, where the rugged Cumberland Mountains obscured the view of the outside world. Here, time moved slowly, sometimes so slowly that it felt as if it had stopped a long time ago. The entire district has fewer than 800 people. There's a single intersection with traffic lights, an old courthouse dating back to the late 19th century. 3 small churches where people go more often than the police station. The nearest hospital is a 40-minute drive along winding mountain roads, often completely cut off by snow and ice in the winter. The law enforcement force consists of a single elected sheriff, 2 full-time deputies, and a part-time switchboard operator who also owns the town's hardware store. When major incidents occur, they offer little more than a presence and goodwill. The rest is up to the residents to manage. In Harlan County, land is more than just property. It's family history, honor, the only thing people can cling to amidst generations of poverty. Land boundaries aren't just drawn on paper, but in memory, in the stories of their ancestors, in markers that only exist in memory. When the law is far away, people learn to trust the law of the mountains, and it is in that void that tragedy finds room to grow, silently, until the day it erupts. In Appalachia, land is not just for farming or exploitation. Land is the story of the family. It is the place where one is born and raised. It is proof that a lineage has survived, endured, and has not been wiped out by poverty and time. The people here grew up with stories about land boundaries passed down through generations, not through maps or archived records, but through the father's instructions as he led his son along the mountainside. Starting from the old oak tree, following the dry stream, circling around the saddle-shaped rock, and stopping where the afternoon sun first touched. Those boundary markers live on in memory longer than any piece of paper. Therefore, land encroachment is not just about taking away a few rows of trees. It is an insult. It is a declaration that the memory of our ancestors is worthless. In a place where people rarely have money, land becomes the ultimate measure of self-worth. Losing land means losing one's place in the community, losing something that can be left to one's children. In Appalachian culture, honor is inextricably linked to the land. Protecting the land means protecting family, protecting the names of the deceased. When the law fails to act promptly, people believe they have a duty to stand up and maintain those boundaries themselves. And it is this deeply ingrained belief, both beautiful and dangerous, that can turn even the smallest conflicts into irreparable tragedies. Blackburn Ridge is not a straight line on a map. It's a long, winding ridge through oak and pine forests, where morning mist often lingers until midday. For over a century, this ridge has been the silent boundary between 2 families. The west side belonged to the Hennessy family from the mid-19th century. The east side belonged to the Wullo family after the Civil War. 2 names, two families coexisted side by side, rarely touching. The boundary between them had been defined only twice, through rudimentary surveys based on mountain peaks and natural watersheds. Where the water flows, the land belongs. That rule was simple, easy to understand, and enough to maintain peace for many generations. But mountains don't stand still. Rain erodes, forests are exploited, and rocks and soil shift slowly over the years. Eventually, even the mountain itself will no longer remember where it once stood. For decades, that change didn't cause any problems. The two families weren't close, but they weren't enemies either. They greeted each other when they met, helped each other when needed, and avoided encroaching too deeply on each other's territory. Blackburn Ridge was then just a stretch of wood, not a battle line. But when money began to tie itself to each tree, when that blurred line was brought into focus under the light of paperwork and self-interest, the long history of the two families was no longer enough to maintain balance. The mountain that had once been a peaceful boundary slowly became the focal point of a tragedy neither of them could have foreseen. Clayton Hennessy was 51 years old in 1972, a man who grew up in the mountains, broad-shouldered, his hands scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. He was a third-generation tobacco farmer, the son of the sons of those who had settled this land before Harlan County even existed. Clayton had only ever left the mountains once, when he enlisted and went to Korea. The war left him with a quiet, unapproachable demeanor. He rarely spoke of what he had seen, but those who lived with him understood that Clayton had learned a very simple lesson. When everything falls apart, no one will come to save you but yourself. He returned, married Darlene, started a family, and lived out his life on the land his father had left him. There was no electricity until the mid-60s, no telephone. Water came from a spring well. 4 children grew up in poverty but were close-knit, all living around the family estate. For Clayton, that was success. Not money, but the fact that his children didn't have to leave the mountains. Clayton's beliefs were clear. The land belonged to his family, not because of the paperwork, but because of the sweat, the memories, and the names buried within it. He didn't believe in distant laws, in offices he'd never set foot in. He believed his father's admonition that if he didn't protect his land himself, no one else would. And it was that very belief, forged over generations, that led Clayton to a crossroads from which he could never turn back. James Willow was 7 years younger than Clayton Hennessy, but his life's path had taken a very different turn. James had left Harlan County. He enlisted in the Army, fought in the Vietnam War, worked on construction sites in Knoxville, and even spent a winter away from home in Michigan, where factories and assembly lines replaced the familiar mountains and forests. Those years instilled in James a belief in a new order: paperwork, contracts, maps, laws. For him, land was still important, but it was an asset that needed to be accurately measured, protected by records and seals, not just by memory or oral tradition. When he returned to the mountains, James carried with him the mindset of the outside world, believing that all disputes could be resolved through proper procedures. James was a reputable businessman, careful and meticulous, but also quick-tempered when challenged. He had been through a failed marriage, carried the burden of debt, and had the responsibility of raising 2 teenage sons. For James, the woods on Blackburn Ridge were not just a legacy, but his only chance at financial security. When hiring the surveyors, James believed he was doing the right thing. He didn't think he was offending anyone, much less crossing sacred boundaries in someone else's mind. But it was precisely this belief in modern paperwork and laws that brought James directly into contact with a world governed by tradition and honor. And where these two perspectives clashed, neither side was truly willing to back down. The mistake began not with hatred, but with the overconfidence of a young man who believed that modern science could replace the memory of an entire mountain. When James Willow hired the surveying unit from Kingsport, he thought he was doing the most careful thing possible: a clear map, neatly aligned markers, and all disputes would be resolved. Dennis Phelps, a newly graduated surveyor, brought along state-of-the-art equipment and aerial photographs. He stood on Blackburn Ridge, gazing at the current peak, and believed it to be the boundary. But what he didn't know, or wasn't taught enough about, was that the legal boundary here wasn't at its highest point today. It lay at the watershed line from over 80 years ago, when the mountain stood in a different position. The boundary markers were driven in, regularly, precisely as calculated, but they were off by nearly 180 yards. A small difference on the map, but a significant part of a person's memory and honor. The first trees felled on that land were not just timber. For Clayton Hennessy, it was a sign of encroachment, of someone taking away something his family had preserved for generations. None of them understood that a single technical error, a single ill-considered decision, had sown the seeds of tragedy. An unintentional mistake, but when it landed in the soil of doubt, poverty, and honor, it began to grow into something uncontrollable. Clayton Hennessy didn't call the police. He didn't seek a lawyer either. Following the mountain path, he drove himself to James Willow's residence to speak in person. The two men stood facing each other, amidst the familiar mountains and forests, yet the distance between them had never seemed greater. Clayton spoke slowly and firmly. He stated that the trees being cut down were on his family's land, that the boundary had been passed down from his ancestors for generations, that the logging had to stop immediately. There was no room for negotiation in his words, only absolute conviction that what he believed to be right. James listened, then produced the survey. The paperwork was clear, the numbers accurate, and it bore an official stamp. He stated that he had followed proper procedures and paid to ensure no infringement was committed. If Clayton disagreed, he should hire another surveyor and prove it. To James, it was sound advice, but to Clayton, it was a complete denial of his family memories. He heard not a solution, but a chilling message, that the truth belonged to the wealthy, and that people like him had no place in that system. Clayton left without another word. In that moment, the last glimmer of hope that everything could be resolved through words crumbled. And when the dialogue ended, only the dangerous silence of a conflict with no way out remained. After fruitless dialogue, Clayton Hennessy chose the only method he believed was still effective. He personally drove wooden stakes along the boundary his family had remembered for generations. Each stake was painted red, the color of warning, the color of blood, the color that indicated this was the final limit. A few days later, James Willow's logging crew came across those painted stakes in the woods. They pulled them up, threw them aside, and continued sawing. Clayton returned, quietly driving in new stakes, this time deeper, stronger. The cycle repeated throughout the summer and into the following year. No one called the police. No one sought reconciliation. Both sides believed that the law either wasn't on their side or would come too late to matter. The conflict gradually moved beyond the boundaries of the timber and into small but hostile acts. Clayton's cattle strayed onto land James claimed as his. Sections of the forest were cleared right down to the red-painted stakes. Then, one night, 3 of James's piles of firewood were burned. No witnesses, no evidence. The file was created and then closed in silence. In Harlan County, the absence of law is not empty. It is filled with suspicion, with accumulated anger, with a sense that each person must defend what they believe is right. And when no one steps in to stop it, the conflict escalates, slowly but irreversibly, toward a day when all boundaries will be erased by violence. The morning of the 11th of November, 1972, began like any other working morning in Harlan County. It was cold. Dew still clung to the trees, and the dirt road leading up to Blackburn Ridge bore the marks of old tires. 14 lumberjacks gathered early, quickly drank cold coffee, exchanged a few everyday stories, and set off. They are not criminals. They are men accustomed to living off the forest, familiar with the sound of chainsaws and the smell of fresh wood. Some have been doing this work since they were 16. Some have young children waiting for their wages before winter. The youngest is only 19. The oldest is over 50. They come here to work, not to confront anyone. They carried saws, axes, iron wedges, and grappling hooks. No one carried a gun. In their minds, this was just another day of logging, on land already clearly marked with survey stakes. They believed their paperwork protected them. They believed the boundaries were defined, and they believed they would return home in the afternoon, tired but safe. None of those 14 people knew they were entering a forest where faith had long since crumbled. A place where contradictions had accumulated so thickly that, in a single moment, they would all explode, sweeping away the lives of those who had no other choice. Around 9:15 in the morning, as the chainsaws ceased their operation to begin clearing branches, a sudden, discordant sound echoed through the Blackburn Ridge forest. A dry, sharp bang ripped through the stillness of the winter morning. The first bullet struck Terry Buckland. He fell almost instantly, before he could understand what was happening. In the next few seconds, other explosions rained down from the western slope, rapid, intense, and without warning. One man fell. Another screamed. The entire forest slope descended into chaos. The loggers scattered instinctively for survival. Some ran down the slope, slipping and falling on wet leaves. Others plunged into the bushes, seeking cover behind recently felled trees. Some knelt beside their wounded colleagues, then collapsed as the next bullet pierced what they believed to be a safe space. The gunfire lasted for a few minutes, but to those present, it felt like it would never end. No one could clearly see the shooter. There was only gunpowder smoke, the whistling of bullets, and the chilling sensation of knowing they were being hunted. Some were hit while running. Others were shot while lying on the ground, unable to move. When everything finally fell silent, the forest returned to its eerie stillness. 12 men lay scattered on the hillside, blood soaking into the cold earth. 2 others, severely wounded, crawled away in despair, carrying the fear that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blackburn Ridge, that morning, was no longer a workplace. It had become a field of death. When the gunfire ceased, Blackburn Ridge was silent, devoid of cries for help. Only the ragged breaths of those still alive remained. Of the 14 men who had gone up the mountain that morning, only 2 had survived. Michael Sutter was only 19 years old. He had been shot multiple times, but his survival instincts had pulled him away from that deadly place. Michael crawled down the mountainside, his shirt soaked with blood, his vision blurring with each breath. He didn't remember how long he'd crawled, only the fear that if he stopped, he would die like the others. When a farmer found Michael by the roadside, he could only manage to whisper a few disjointed words before collapsing unconscious. The other man was Douglas Kemp, more severely wounded. Douglas crawled into a hollow tree trunk, curling up like a child sheltering from a storm. The blow to the head had shattered his memory. Douglas could no longer remember the gunshots, nor the faces of those who had fallen. When found the next day, he was alive, but a part of him remained forever in that forest. The accounts they left behind were incomplete. There was no face of the shooter, no clear sequence of events, only the feeling of being attacked from nowhere and an unnameable terror. But it was these fragmented memories that opened the door to the investigation and to a truth far more complex than anyone initially imagined. In the early afternoon, as Deputy Sheriff Martin Crowell and his support forces entered Blackburn Ridge, the silence of the forest became suffocatingly heavy. There were no chainsaw sounds, no calls to each other, only wet leaves, cold mud, and scattered bodies lying as if abandoned in the woods. The bodies stretched for nearly half a mile, not clustered together. The way they fell spoke volumes more than any testimony. Some lay beside freshly felled logs. Others lay in the middle of the escape route, their hands still outstretched as if clinging to life. On the ground, more than 60 spent shell casings gleamed in the dim light, clustered along the western edge of the forest, in high, secluded positions, directly below the mountainside. Those gunshots weren't from panic. They showed preparation, anticipation. No guns were found near the victims. No signs of resistance. Some were shot while fleeing. Others were hit after they had fallen, unable to get up. This caused the investigators to pause for a long time, bowing their heads before the scene. In that moment, Blackburn Ridge was no longer a land dispute or an ambiguous boundary. It emerged as a cold ambush where 14 men had entered the woods to work and left in a way none of them, nor their families, could have ever imagined. Night fell over Harlan County in a heavy atmosphere. News of the massacre spread faster than any explanation. Everyone knew about the dispute over Blackburn Ridge. And in the minds of many, the name Hennessy came to mind almost immediately, as a pre-prepared answer. Around 10 o'clock at night, law enforcement surrounded the Hennessy farm. The old wooden house was dimly lit by yellow lights amidst the darkness of the mountains and forests. Clayton Hennessy sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him. When the police entered, he did not resist. He did not run. He rose slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Clayton's 3 sons, along with several other relatives, were handcuffed and taken away in the night. For the victims' families, it was a moment of hope. They believed that justice had finally arrived. But for longtime residents of Harlan County, the scene evoked a different feeling, that everything was happening too quickly. That judgment had come before the truth could be revealed. The guns seized from Hennessy's home were neatly arranged in a cabinet, neither concealed nor cleaned. Clayton said only one thing: "I want to see a lawyer." Between the fine line of law and public trust, questions began to surface, though no one dared voice them. Was this justice being served, or simply prejudice finding a place to rest? The trial opened in the spring of 1973, when the mountain roads had just thawed. The courtroom was packed. The families of the victims sat silently on one side, carrying photographs and memories that had not yet faded. On the other side were the Hennessy family, familiar faces from the mountains, now the focus of scrutinizing gazes. The prosecutor spoke of ambushes, of planning, of bloodshed on the mountainside. The defense attorney spoke of land, of boundaries, of a man who believed he was protecting the last thing belonging to his family. The 2 stories ran parallel, never intersecting, like 2 paths leading to 2 different truths. The jury was made up of locals. They understood the written law, but also the unwritten laws of the mountains and forests. They knew what land meant to a poor family. They also knew that 14 lives could not be merely a side effect of a dispute. Every testimony, every piece of evidence was weighed not only by reason, but also by the shared memories and culture they all shared. When the doors of the deliberation room closed, the entire town held its breath. No one believed there would be a verdict that would satisfy everyone. Because in Harlan County, the law and mountain justice have never been on the same side. And in that trial, people began to realize that, whatever the sentence, it would leave irreparable cracks in the heart of this community. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the room was enveloped in a heavy silence. There was no glimmer of hope in their eyes, only tense faces, as if everyone had braced themselves for an unsatisfactory outcome. The verdict was read slowly. There was no charge of felony murder. Clayton Hennessy and his 2 sons were found guilty of manslaughter. The rest were acquitted. In that moment, there was no cheering. Only sighs escaped from many directions, carrying conflicting emotions but a shared sense of emptiness. The victims' families slumped into their seats. For them, justice had slipped from their grasp. 14 men were gone, but no one had been held accountable for their loss. On the other side, the Hennessy family felt no victory either. Years in prison awaited them. Their reputation was ruined. Too high a price to pay for what they believed was their right to protect their land. That verdict did nothing to mend the relationship. It closed the trial, but not the pain. In Harlan County, people understood that there were no winners that day. Only people walked out of the courtroom with the feeling that justice, as they had once believed, had not been on anyone's side. After the trial, Harlan County tried to return to its normal rhythm of life. But for those who had stood amidst the Blackburn Ridge scene, something refused to settle. The numbers, the shell casings, the firing positions continued to haunt them silently, like an unanswered question. Of the more than 60 spent cartridges recovered, one group did not match any of the Hennessy family's guns. A misplaced clue. A small discrepancy, but enough to catch the attention of those in the trade off guard. This fourth gun did not appear in the seizure records. No one claimed it. And in court, it was set aside, as if its silence were acceptable. But for some investigators, the silence was too great. They recalled the way the shell casings were scattered along the edge of the forest, the angles of the shots that didn't quite match, the feeling that something in the story remained obscured. Not everyone spoke out, but many thought alike. If a gun didn't belong to Hennessy, then someone else must have been on the mountain that morning. Those doubts weren't enough to change the verdict, but they didn't disappear. They subsided, smoldering in the memories of those who had seen too much blood to believe everything had been fully explained. And it was from these repressed doubts that another door gradually opened, leading to a truth far more complex and painful. Years passed, and the Blackburn Ridge case seemed closed on paper, but in the hearts of some investigators, it was never truly over. They carried the heavy feeling that they had witnessed a truth split in two, a picture hastily pieced together to satisfy time and public opinion. When the files were reopened, every minute detail was brought to the table once again. The location of the shell casings, the angle of fire, the distance between the bodies. What had once been considered the chaos of a massacre now began to emerge as two overlapping stories. New analyses showed that not all victims fell at the same time. Some died later, in different locations, with mismatched bullet trajectories. That thought sent a lull through the office. If there were two separate shooting sequences, Blackburn Ridge wasn't just one mass murder. It was two murders occurring in the same space, shrouded in the same fear and the same chaos. That implied a far more terrifying possibility. Someone had entered the scene later, or simultaneously, and exploited the chaos to inflict further deaths. For those reopening the investigation, this is no longer a purely legal issue. It becomes a moral question. How many people have been convicted of deaths they did not cause? And how many families have buried loved ones without knowing the whole truth? Blackburn Ridge, once again, forces everyone to confront the possibility that justice has been misplaced. And too late. 11 years after the bloodshed on Blackburn Ridge, the truth didn't come from the courtroom or the press. It came from a man who walked into the coroner's office with a weary face and eyes that had nothing left to lose. He said he had carried this burden for too long, that every night he heard the gunshots echoing in his head. The confession revealed a colder reality than any previous hypothesis. It wasn't just a feud between two families. It wasn't just the vague boundary of a mountain. Behind it all were money, contracts, and decisions signed in a remote office where the mountains and people appeared only as numbers. According to testimony, a timber company hired people to make logging on Blackburn Ridge dangerous. The initial goal wasn't to kill, but to intimidate, disrupt, and force competitors to retreat. But once the first shots were fired, once chaos engulfed the forest, greed took over, fear turned into violence, and violence turned into massacre. The details in the confession matched gaps that investigators had suspected for years. The fourth gun, the later shots, the moved bodies. It all pieced together to form a picture where the lives of 14 men were crushed between local conflict and unseen greed. When corporate greed came to light, outrage spread. Not just for those who pulled the trigger, but for those who had never set foot in the mountains, yet contributed to pushing the tragedy to an irreversible point. And at that moment, Harlan County understood that Blackburn Ridge was not just a story of the mountains, but proof that power and money could kill without even being present at the scene. When the name of the lumber company came to light, many in Harlan County understood for the first time that the tragedy on Blackburn Ridge was not simply born of local animosity. It was fueled by money, by power, and by the cold divide between those who made the decisions and those who suffered the consequences. In offices hundreds of miles from the mountains, the forest is merely a reserve, the trees are merely a yield, and people are just an acceptable variable in the profit equation. Money flows out under harmless names: consulting, operating costs, field support. But behind them are orders never written down. Make the place dangerous. Make others retreat. The lumberjacks who died on Blackburn Ridge had no idea they had become entangled in a business war. They hadn't signed contracts. They didn't understand the strategy. They had simply entered the woods to work and been drawn into a vortex created by people they had never even seen. As the investigation deepened, financial records and fragmented testimonies began to piece together a terrifying truth. Blood had been spilled not only because of land disputes, but because profit was prioritized over human lives. Blackburn Ridge became a place where money and power touched the mountains and forests in the most ruthless way. And once the moral boundaries were crossed, no one involved in the game could wash their hands clean. When the new verdict was delivered, there was no cheering, no relief. The court acknowledged that the original picture was flawed, that crucial evidence had been overlooked, that part of the truth had been buried in haste and pressure. Some sentences were overturned. Some sentences were adjusted. Those cold words were read aloud as if time could be turned back. But time cannot be turned back. The years in prison cannot be returned. The mornings on Blackburn Ridge cannot be relived. For the families of the victims, the belated justice is nothing more than an inadequate apology. Their loved ones have long been dead, and the truth has only just been partially revealed. For the Hennessy family, the verdict brought mixed feelings. There was relief that their voices had finally been heard, but there was also bitterness because the price paid was too high. Honor could not be restored. Years lost could not be compensated. Justice, when delayed, is no longer salvation. It is merely a reflection of what should have been done long ago. And in Harlan County's view, that verdict closes the case, but not the pain. After the court closed the case, the Blackburn Ridge tragedy didn't end. It merely left the headlines and seeped deeper into the lives of those left behind. Sentences may change, but the consequences are never truly judged. While Clayton Hennessy served his sentence, Darlene, his wife of nearly 30 years, silently endured it all. Visits became infrequent. The community's scrutinizing gaze grew. The economic burden weighed heavily on a woman accustomed only to the kitchen and the fields. In 1979, Darlene died of a stroke. Clayton always believed that stress, humiliation, and loneliness had killed his wife before he could return. Clayton was released from prison with graying hair and a hunched back. He returned to his old home, but everything had changed. Darlene was gone. The peace was gone. Only memories remained, and long evenings where the sounds of the forest echoed, reminding him of a day that would never leave his mind. For the survivors, the wounds weren't physical, but mental. Michael Sutter carried the fear with him for life. He couldn't return to the forest, couldn't bear the sound of breaking wood or the smell of damp leaves. Nightmares came unexpectedly, dragging him back to that morning. Douglas Kemp lived on with a fragmented memory, as if a part of him had been left behind in a hollow tree trunk on the mountainside. The consequences of Blackburn Ridge were not just death. They were broken lives, families living on in silence, and a pain that lasted longer than any sentence the court ever handed down. Today, if you walk up Blackburn Ridge, there are few signs that this place was once the epicenter of a tragedy. The forest has grown back, thick and green, covering the blood-soaked patches of land. The old paths are erased by dry leaves and tree roots. The sound of birds has replaced the sound of gunfire. The wind sweeps through the trees as if nothing ever happened. The old survey stakes have long since rotted away. Clayton Hennessy's red-painted stakes have also vanished with time. The boundary that once drove people to kill each other is no longer visible to the naked eye. Only the mountains and forests stand there, silent, like a witness that never speaks. To outsiders, Blackburn Ridge is a wild, untamed, natural landscape. But for families who have lost loved ones, it remains a cemetery without headstones. They know their children, husbands, and fathers fell somewhere beneath this earth, though they cannot pinpoint the exact location. The forest may conceal traces, but it cannot erase memories. Every time the mist descends, every time winter returns, Blackburn Ridge still carries the story of 14 men who never returned home. And in that silence, one realizes that nature can heal the wounds of the land, but it can never completely heal the wounds of humanity. The story of Blackburn Ridge ends without a complete resolution. Only lingering, heavy questions remain, questions no one dares to claim they have the right answers to. Was Clayton Hennessy protecting his land, or had he crossed the line of human morality? Were the lumberjacks victims of a local dispute, or of greed from a place they never knew? And ultimately, on whose side did justice prevail? The law speaks through its terms and judgments. The mountains and forests speak through memory and honor. When these two worlds collide, there isn't always a clear right or wrong. Only people trapped between poverty, beliefs, and choices they were unprepared to face. If the boundary lines had been measured correctly all those years ago, would those 14 men still be alive? If the law had arrived in time, would Clayton have had to stand up for himself to defend what he believed ultimately belonged to his family? If money and power hadn't infiltrated the mountains, would the tragedy have stopped before it was too late? Blackburn Ridge leaves behind a harsh truth that in forgotten communities, justice isn't always present when it's needed most. And when people are pushed to their limits, the choices they make can destroy not only others, but their own lives. The question remains, but the answer, perhaps, is buried with those who never returned. When this story concludes, what remains is not just an old case, but a heavy, hard-to-describe feeling. Blackburn Ridge doesn't ask us to judge. It simply compels us to pause and think. Think of the 14 men who left home on a cold morning and never returned. Think of the families who lived their entire lives with an unfillable void. And think of the choices made in silence, in places where the law doesn't have time to intervene. If you were Clayton Hennessy, what would you do, believing that no one was protecting you? If you were the loggers, what would you believe when you entered that forest? And if you were an outsider to this story, what lesson would you learn for your own community? If this story makes you pause a little longer, please leave your thoughts. Every share is a way to ensure that the names of those lost are not forgotten. And sometimes, simply listening to and remembering them is the closest thing we can do to justice.